Well, for several years, you've seen news reports about these protesters from the Westboro Baptist Church protesting at military funerals, holding up anti-gay signs such as "God hates fags" and other signs such as "Thank God for dead soldiers." It was a Supreme Court case yesterday, and now we are joined by lawyers from both sides of the Snyder versus Phelps, Snyder versus Westboro Baptist Church case. From Kansas City, Missouri, Margie Phelps, the lead lawyer for the Westboro Baptist Church and for her father, Fred Phelps. And from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Timothy Nieman, who filed an amicus brief on behalf of the Veterans for Foreign Wars on behalf of the Snyder family. Mrs. Phelps, if you would briefly state for our audience the argument that you made to the Supreme Court yesterday on behalf of the Westboro Baptist Church.
Sure. The 7 Westboro Baptist Church picketers were over 1,000 feet from the church. Between them and the funeral goers were over 100 other people engaged in expressive activity. No one going into the funeral saw or heard the Westboro picketers. And when it was time for the funeral to start, they left. So by any definition or rationale, there was no invasion of privacy. As to the disagreement with viewpoint, because that's what the case is really about. They don't like the viewpoint, they don't like the core message that your soldiers are dying for your sins. Well, the court's been clear for too many years that using subjective terms like outrage and offense and only claiming an adverse emotional impact from words is not a sufficient interest to override the First Amendment right to engage in robust public debate. All the nation is talking about these dying soldiers. The majority view, like 310 million of you to 60 of us. The majority view is he's a hero and God is blessing America. Our dissenting view is that he put on the uniform of a nation that is fast chasing same-sex marriage and has made proud sin of every kind its policies.
All right, Mrs. Phelps,
and God is not blessing America. So the dissenting view is protected by the First Amendment. You don't need a First Amendment for the popular view.
Now, Mrs. Phelps, one of the arguments that you stated earlier was there was no invasion of privacy. Do you think that the case would be different if perhaps you had been seen during the funeral, if the Snyder family had seen you protesting? Would there be a different case?
Not if we had been seen. Not if we had been seen. Taking the line of cases about abortion picketers, the court's been clear. Merely seeing words you don't like does not create liability. Avert your eyes. But if, for example, we had walked into the church with our picket signs, then liability may be appropriate. And of course, everyone knows that's not how we do business.
All right, Mrs. Phelps, thank you. Timothy Nieman, briefly, if you would, state the argument made by the Snyder side of this case.
Thank you, Peter. And this case really isn't about just being able to avert your eyes. I think that the argument that was made yesterday by Mr. Summers on behalf of Mr. Snyder was, the question was best summed up by Justice Ginsburg, who asked, this is really a case about exploiting a private family's grief. And the question is, why should the First Amendment tolerate exploiting this Marine's family at this vulnerable time when they wanted to have a private funeral ceremony for their son? The Snyder family did not ask for the Westboro Church to come to the funeral. Mr. Snyder was not a public figure, despite what the Westboro Church might say about that. He was merely trying to put his son to rest and had the unfortunate situation where the only time that he would have the opportunity to do that, you cannot redo a funeral ceremony, you cannot redo a burial. That sacred time of mourning was turned into a circus by the presence of the Westboro Baptist Church folks being there. This isn't a case about the content of the message. It is really a case, again, as Justice Ginsburg, I thought so eloquently put it yesterday, about exploiting a private family's grief. And in this case, it happens to be a private family of a fallen American soldier, and that's why the VFW in particular got involved with this case.
Mrs. Phelps?
Yes, you want me to answer that?
Yes, ma'am.
Of course, exploiting someone's grief doesn't hook into any legal principle. All it is emotive, undisciplined language. Mr. Snyder, I will use that language, Mr. Snyder exploited his own grief when within 2 days of his son's death, he began holding forth in multiple media interviews, complaining about the war, complaining about the dying soldiers, asking in the public airwaves how many more parents were going to have to suffer like he and his ex-wife were suffering over this senseless war. You don't get to start a public discussion in that fashion without letting other people answer. And if you don't want that discussion to take place on the occasion of your son's death or funeral, don't start the discussion on that occasion. They've turned these funerals of these soldiers into patriotic pep rallies, more expressive activity going on outside. And long after we were gone on the whole 15-mile route to the cemetery, we don't go to cemeteries, we don't follow the procession. Others do and engage in expressive activity. You can't open up a public dialogue and then tell one viewpoint to shut up. If you think that's exploitive, stop doing it. When soldiers' funerals are private, we don't go. But when you invite the media, when you invite the Patriot Guard riders, when you invite all the public, including putting your obituary in the Baltimore Sun, that big newspaper, when you've got no connection to Baltimore, you don't live in Baltimore. They did all that on purpose to have a big, giant, splashy public display because they want this nation to come and bow down to those dead soldiers.
All right.
Now, you made all those
Timothy
decisions.
Nieman, final word before we go to calls.
You know, putting an obituary in a newspaper, if that's the standard for becoming a public figure, every single American citizen who has a family member that dies, whether they're a military member or just a common everyday guy, opens themselves to this sort of protest. It was put in the Baltimore Sun because the funeral was held in a town that was in with reasonable proximity to Baltimore. It's not as if the obituary is put in newspapers all across the United States. And this is another point that I thought the justices did an excellent job with yesterday. You can turn any single item into a matter of public concern. For example, I know on your show you have a Republican line, a Democratic line, and an independent line for people to call in to voice their opinions. I mean, if a Democrat dies and they put an obituary in a newspaper, you could open that up to all kinds of disruptive protests just because they happen to be a registered Democrat or a registered Republican or whatever it may be. I mean, there's no end to where this could go if we allow the Phelps's position to go forward in this situation.
Timothy Nieman is in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He's an attorney for the VFW, which filed an amicus brief on behalf of the Snyder family. Margie Phelps is in Kansas City, Missouri, attorney for Fred Phelps Sr. and for the Westboro Baptist Church. She is a graduate of Washburn University School of Law. First call for our two guests, Oakford, Pennsylvania. Barb, Independent Line.
Hi.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I think this is just so wrong what this woman and that Baptist group is trying to do. I mean, a funeral is a private event. I don't understand how the law can see it any other way. There must be a way to make the case that this is a private event. And
Mr. Nieman, is there another way to make this a case that this is a private event?
Well, I do, and that's one of the primary approaches that we took in our brief. The Supreme Court has carved out an exception to free speech issues, which is called the captive audience doctrine. And basically what that says is that if you are in a place where you are a captive audience, for example, if you're in your home, the court has applied it also in hospital settings, but if you're in a situation where you really can't leave, For example, the house is described in these cases as the last form of refuge. The court has said you can put restrictions on that. You can bar picketers in front of people's houses. You can limit picketing in front of hospitals. And the VFW believes, and other people that have filed briefs in this case and argue it, that the captive attendees at a funeral, if you attend a funeral, you're in a captive audience. You only have one opportunity to lay your loved one, your friend, husband, wife, son, whatever it may be, daughter, to rest. And you have to be there. You have to be at that church. You have to be at that location in order to do that. You don't get to do it twice. And I believe that the captive audience doctrine is a way to accomplish that, for the court to reach the right decision in a constitutional way that has already been articulated by the court in similar cases in the past.
Margie Phelps, the captive audience argument.
Of course, we're very familiar with that doctrine, and we discussed it at length yesterday, and the court has been explicit. In order for the captive audience doctrine to apply, the picketer has got to be right out front, up in your grill, confronting you physically, making it impractical for you to get from your car to inside without running a gauntlet of picketers. 1,000 feet away, out of sight, out of sound. What an irresponsible misrepresentation to suggest that the captive audience doctrine would apply to that situation. They didn't even see the 7 picketers, so how could they have been captive to them? That funeral went off without a hitch. Every detail that was planned for that funeral happened without disruption. The priest who did it, who did the ceremony, testified he didn't even know there were picketers there. No one mentioned them, no one was aware of them, and then they got in their cars and went 15 miles to the cemetery with our picketers long gone.
Margie Phelps, was this the first time you've argued in front of the Supreme Court, and what was your experience like?
It is the first time, and my experience was that it was absolutely marvelous. Of course, I feel quite privileged representing this little church in the highest court in the world, but I also find that the justices are familiar with their cases and professional, and gave the church a fair opportunity to be heard on their conscientious, faithful ministry.
Mr. Nieman, what was your experience like in the court?
Well, it was a great experience for me as well. I did not have the pleasure of arguing the case yesterday, and I would just like to say to Ms. Phelps, I thought she did a very nice job. I may not agree with her position, but I thought she did a good job before the court. It was a great experience, and I agree the justices seemed extremely interested in the case. They seemed extremely knowledgeable, and they really honed in on the issues that are at task here. And I think they probably could have continued the argument much longer than they did if there had been time for it.
John in Leesburg, Virginia, Republican line. You're on with Margie Phelps and Timothy Nieman. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm a veteran of the U.S. Navy, and I just wanted to point out that in this case and all these cases that the church would go to somebody's funeral that gave their life for this country, they gave up everything. They gave up all their rights. That individual gave up everything that they can give. And I do not think the right of freedom of speech should be used to make the point they're trying to make. They just want the public forum and the attention to put their message out.
John, now you say you don't think they should be able to use or should use it, but do you think they should have the right to use it?
I don't think so. I think.
And where do you draw the line? On the free speech issues.
Military people that gave their lives to this country.
Well, Margie Phelps, 48 states have passed laws, essentially laws against what the Westboro Baptist Church does. George W. Bush in 2006 signed the National Cemeteries Act, essentially in response to what your group has been doing. Are those, in your view, constitutional laws?